Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another Warhammer 40,000 Conquest video production. My name is Mitch, and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today, I'm pleased to present yet another installment in my series of Community Spotlight videos, in which I interview various prominent and upstanding members of our Conquest LCG community. Specifically, we discuss their favorite decks and how best to play their favorite warlords. Hopefully, through sharing their personal experience, opinions, and advice, they'll be able to provide you with a host of information useful to both new and veteran players alike. Be sure to let me know what you think of this interview in the comments below, and as always, I'm ever open to constructive criticism. But with our introduction aside, let's get things started with a discussion of Baharroth. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, but before we start to build ourselves some cosplay wings out of papier-mâché, where might our viewers know you from, and how may people have heard of you before?
Well, I am, some might say, the better half of the First Planet podcast. Scott, who is, I forget, which warlord did Scott do?
He did Ragnar.
Ragnar. Okay, so he was on one of these episodes earlier, and I'm sure he probably said the exact same thing. But yeah, I go by Boogers McGee on the forums, so that's Card Game DB in the FFG forums. You may have heard me there, as well as on Octagon. Many people have played against me. Many people have had the pleasure of beating me. And yeah, it's where I'm most commonly seen within the community anyways.
Well, excellent. Hopefully one day I'll be able to count myself among those number of players that have bested you in glorious combat, but seeing as how we're both here to talk about Conquest today, how did you get started in the first place? How long have you been playing, and how did you initially get into the game?
Well, my interest in the game actually came, oh man, I would even go back 20 years ago when I started the tabletop game. There was right about this about 5 years after I started playing the tabletop 40K game, there was a collectible card game that came out, and I got into that rather heavily. And of course, that slowly just disappeared from store shelves, and it was inevitably canceled. But that kind of always left a hole in what I thought was a great 40K tradition with lots of board games from Fantasy Flight
Sure.
and the tabletop wargaming, tons of video games, but no actual card games. So when this was announced, the moment it was announced, me and all of my larger mammal friends got together and bought as many core sets as we could find, to the extent where they were actually sold out in our city. I don't know, for about a month after launch. So I've been playing it since we could get our hands on it, essentially.
Awesome. I mean, that's fantastic. Since I personally got started in the LCG scene, this was always a game that I was hoping and praying for. But as someone that played Tyranids, well, collected and painted Tyranids, not so much played the actual tabletop game, I was a little too butthurt when they were excluded from the core set to pay much attention to the game. But, you know, out of all the warlords we've seen so far, you chose Eldar Starbane as your personal favorite. But because your schedule is a little bit tricky, and John kind of capitalized on the opportunity to talk about him first, one of your runner-ups was Baharroth. So what makes our second Eldar faction warlord particularly appealing? Why would anyone in their right mind want to play any Eldar option apart from Starbane?
Well, Starbane is good. He's a fantastic warlord, but Baharroth is fun, and I find that there's this pattern almost with all the warlords where um, things like Nazdrag is good, but Zogwart is fun. So you get these sort of the tournament warlord, and then the for fun warlord.
Sure.
Baharroth is probably, of the for fun warlords, one of the best. I would say his number one tool is clearly his mobility, but also the fact that he has access to, I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's the most 2 command pip units in the game. And he has that access in a very, very efficient manner. So he can get, as an example, um, he can use Scythe Mercenaries. He can use Vile Raiders,
Right.
and he can also use Soaring Falcons. And with the combination of the latter two and Death from Above, he can get those out for one cost. So for one resource, he's getting 2 command pips on multiple units.
Sure. I mean, it sounds like just overall a pretty strong board presence, not only during, say, the command phase due to the flexibility inherent to mobility, but also just being able to toss myriad command icon laden units all over the table.
Absolutely.
I suppose apart from that, are there any other strengths that stand out? Baharroth kind of strikes me as a relatively, versatile, certainly, but a little bit straightforward hero.
Yeah, I mean, as a warlord himself, he's got no text aside from the keyword mobile. Um, so there's really not a whole lot to him. With that said, though, that's a great threat range. Because he's mobile, he can capture command on one planet, and then two others potentially he can battle at. He can move to another planet and then trigger battle there instead of where he initially committed. So that alone is a fantastic ability. It also keeps him out of harm's way. As a 2/6, he's not exactly the most battle friendly.
Sure,
He,
sure.
he can do some damage, but you really want to keep him out of the fight. So 6 health is fairly low for. I think that's as low as you can get on a warlord
I
so
believe
far.
so. For Hail Warlords, anyways.
Yeah, yeah. So really, we want to keep him out of battle, and mobile's a really great way to do so.
Well, how do you feel that he compares to Eldorath in a strictly command sense? So, Eldorath, you're certainly able to deploy him to one planet and exhaust a unit so that they don't count their command icons. Given that Baharroth, you can, commit him somewhere and then know full well during the combat phase you can kind of adjust or relocate that card. Does it seem about the same?
Well, I would say that it's kind of a loaded question in that you have to break it down by the theme of the deck.
Right.
So Baharroth, more so than Eldorath, is going to lean towards mobile units because that's his signature cards lend themselves to powering up mobile units or units that move. So with that, you're going to see a different unit construction in his deck than you would in Eldorath's. So comparing the two is very difficult.
Sure. It's not just that, microcosm itself. It's just kind of the entire theme of the deck is probably distributing your units in a, not necessarily haphazard sense, but in a way to kind of optimize that command phase, knowing full well that, if you made a quote error or mistake, you can kind of correct for that prior to, any actual battles taking place.
Yeah, exactly. But even more to the point that things like the Soaring Falcon or the Vile Raider that I mentioned earlier, I
Right.
can justify those in a Baharroth deck.
Sure.
I very rarely put them in with Eldorath. And the reason is the cost is too high with very little benefit, especially with the Soaring Falcon with only one attack. it makes it very difficult to justify putting it into an Eldorath deck when other 3 cost units, which is the heaviest slot for Eldar, are going to perform much better for you. So in Baharroth, on the other hand, you can get it out for 1 if you need to, and you're looking at the 2 command pips rather than the attack value.
Right. Well, do you feel like there are any warlords in particular or factions that Baharroth does pretty well against? Any that, really being able to exploit that mobile keyword serves a pretty big benefit?
Yeah, I would say because most Baharroth decks are built around the command phase, anything and it's almost unbeatable in the command phase when you're talking hammer to hammer cost.
Sure.
Um, Anything that doesn't focus on the command phase is a great matchup because that's how you're looking to beat them. Whereas the one that scares me the most is Kugath because I don't want to see those Nurglings on the board.
Right.
Those Nurglings will shred most of my units just because it takes away mobility. It gives you, it adds a penalty to your mobility.
Right.
And that's not something you want to see in a deck that's focused around it.
Well, definitely, and especially when those cards have got, inherent card real estate slotted toward funding that mobile keyword. You're sacrificing hit points or attack to basically pay for that ability or compensate for that ability. So your opponent being able to kind of doubly exploit that has got to be really tough. I don't have experience myself playing that matchup, but it definitely seems like that takes one of those really, looked down upon signature units and kind of puts it probably suddenly on a mountaintop where it's like its moment to absolutely shine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, apart from Kugoth, any other decks that really, rely on that command phase that you're able to perform reasonably well against or better than average?
Uh, Kith is one of those that uh, gives me a run for my money,
Sure.
but I would say everything else, um, it pretty much falls into the same category of if I'm winning command, I'm winning the game. So, and it's fairly consistent in that there aren't many super command heavy decks that will compete with Baharroth in that.
Well, I suppose I don't know if it's necessarily fair for me to accuse Baharroth of being a very low-performing warlord, but he's definitely not seen nearly as much tournament play or made as many tournament appearances as Eldorath has. Do you feel like there's any certain matchup in particular that really holds him back? I mean, when you say you struggle against Kith, certainly she's extremely prominent in the, tournament scene, but what are some of those things that you think keeps this warlord from being more of a presence in competitive play?
The inability to win planets. I wouldn't say that it's another warlord that does that. This is most Baharroth decks, because they're command focused or tend to be, also tend to uh, be late bloomers. So they're not going to show up to play until about third or fourth planet, and by that time, you may be behind the 8 ball.
Right.
So and that's really apparent in the Baharroth Hawks signature unit where there is 0-2. You're not winning planets with a 0-2. They get +3 attack while at the same planet as your warlord, and they're mobile, so there are benefits there. However, it's very rare that you're going to have or be deploying your warlord into a battle right from the beginning. That's too much damage, potentially too much damage on Baharroth too early in the game.
Right.
And that's also uh, you're risking losing command in certain areas, which is what you really want to focus on. So the plan is to not defeat your opponent by killing his units, but by preventing those units from being deployed. And in that, it's a slow ramp.
For sure. And I suppose, definitely if you struggle early on to accomplish that command phase dominance, I could certainly see that becoming quickly an uphill battle if your opponent, gets the momentum that you were trying to deny them. I see that spiraling out of control fairly quickly. It's kind of an interesting alternative to sort of another control-y or not necessarily choke type playstyle, but definitely some interesting control going on there. I suppose just because I could see either faction having, its own unique appeal, who do you generally ally with when you're building a Baharroth deck?
Almost always Dark Eldar.
And I suppose what sways you there? So you're giving up ion rifles, you're giving up
So I've played a few decks where I've allied in Tau, and
sure.
ion rifles give you that punching power that I was saying that they lack.
Right.
However, um, if I find that it's still not enough. So you're still in a position where you've got these weak army units
Right.
that are only better because they're being buffed by attachments. And thus the investment in them has gone up. So you're giving up first off the Incubus Warrior, which is a cheap 2-hammer unit.
Right.
You're giving up the Scythe Mercenary, which is a cheaper 2-hammer unit. You're looking at 2 cost and 1 cost, relatively speaking.
Definitely. And if you're depriving your opponent of resources, it's, yet another tool to leverage against them to, deny them further or just get a high value card.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then, like I said, we want to be avoiding battle with our Warlord until later in the game, where the mobile text doesn't matter because there's no other planets in play. Um, so things like Archon's Terror are extremely valuable. It helps to prevent those battles from getting out of hand, and it leaves you in control of the fights as opposed to being shocked by maybe a bunch of eager recruits that were thrown out unexpectedly, or a drop pod assault that came out of nowhere. So it's those kinds of tools that Dark Eldar really, really help Baharroth with.
Sure. I mean, for someone that might be considering alliance with the Tau, are there any cards that really, that at least make you stop and consider, apart from, the obvious attachments?
Um, the what are they called there? The 2-cost mobile, or
The
sorry, 2-hammer mobile unit.
Vashia Trailblazer.
Yeah, that's a pretty key unit if you're going to include Tau. Absolutely. Uh, it's still not quite enough in my books, but that was the primary one for sure. The other would be no, you know what? I think any other Tau unit would be strictly optional.
Sure.
So, but the Vashia Trailblazer is definitely a really, really important one.
Well, cool. I suppose any other Dark Eldar cards worth mentioning?
Uh, Baleful Mandrakes, they're not um, the command monsters that you'd want, but having a 3/2 ranged unit is always nice. And of course the Bloodied Reavers, they are the Dark Eldar Warlord groupies, and so we're looking at a 2/2 for 2
Right.
with +2 attack while it's at the same planet as a Warlord, and also 1 command pip. So it's still contributing to your command phase, but giving you that punch that you need to take a planet.
Well, and we've kind of touched on this quite a lot, and it's, underlined all the more so when you mention the Bloodied Reavers, which they have to be present at the same planet as your warlord to derive their combat benefit. Baharroth's Hawks have to be present at the same planet, so it's, exposing your relatively fragile warlord to battle after battle after battle. But are there any other significant weaknesses or just areas of vulnerability that players piloting Baharroth should look out for? Or if they're running up against Baharroth, anything for them to exploit? Like, are there any real counters to this warlord?
Yes, but it will be very difficult. So one thing would be playing Ragnar and denying certain locations for using the Space Wolf's Predator to deny committing to certain locations.
Sure.
That's going to be key, but it's going to be exceptionally difficult to make that happen against somebody that's winning command against you on a regular basis.
Right.
The other one would be probably Unshi. However, Eldar still have access to Seer's Exodus, which allows you to remove any number of units from a planet, which is going to give Baharroth the ability to escape from a fight if he needs to. So all in all, I think your best bet is to always go after the command units. So if you're going to start a fight, don't start a fight to take a planet, because you can almost win a planet by default for the first couple rounds.
Right.
But the key is going to be slowing Baharroth's command phase down. Don't let them get that foothold. Don't let them get you to a point where you're not winning command on any planets, which is it's quite easy to do with Baharroth.
So don't let them, blossom into the late game control-y type deck that they really excel at being.
Yeah, I would say if you're winning command on 2 planets against Baharroth, then you're doing a fantastic job.
Cool. And then by mentioning the Space Wolves Predator, I suppose just kind of, to the best of your ability, corralling or attempting to play against that mobile keyword. I mean, especially considering that there's no combat phase command window, I could see that being difficult, but just, I think always limiting your opponent's options is probably never a bad idea.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely corralling. I would say that's the big thing. So as an example, if you put that Space Wolf Predator on planet 2, knowing that you want to win planet 1, you've now denied Baharroth access to 2 planets and created a buffer where he can't mobile to planet 1 to help with the fight. Not easily. He still has his signature event, which is Cry of the Wind, and after a unit moves from one planet to another, move that unit to an adjacent planet. So he still has a threat range of, well, with 2 of these in the deck, 3 planets. So,
sure. But it's only a 2-copy card, and if you're, causing your opponent to expend some of their cards as, instead of shields, their intended effect, and there's a pretty hard cap on how many units they can actually shift, that combat can still be looking awfully good for you.
Well, and that particular card is really only good early in the game, because as planets start to disappear, it becomes less valuable, right? And you have fewer planets to mobile to, a smaller distance to cover. Cry of the Wind becomes more and more useful as a shield the later in the game you get.
Sure. Well, I suppose, are there any specific cards that you really look out for? I mean, certainly the Eldar fraction as a whole is relatively low when it comes to hit points, when it comes to attack, but is there anything that really, is a big red flag, a big, sign of danger?
Anything with Armor Bane. So with the amount of events that you typically get in an Eldar deck, and the amount of potentially attachments if you're allied with Tau, You're usually fairly dependent on those shields. Like you said, Eldar tend to be lower hit points. Shields are where they're at. So Armor Bane is a real killer. The other thing would be anything with 2 command pips. So especially if it's mobile, if you've got, or even 2 command or more. So if you've got, as an example, Ragnar's signature squad with promotion,
Right.
those guys can move all over the board depending on where Ragnar commits. There is potential that you're going to be seeing a 3 command unit on a key planet every single turn. So it's something to be wary of for certain.
Sure. And even though, like you mentioned, you've got access to such a sheer, astounding number of 2 command units, if you're suddenly not able to win a command at a planet by deploying, a single card, that makes, winning that command phase all the more difficult for you, most definitely.
Yeah, remember I said that the best way to beat Baharroth is to be winning command on at least 2 planets.
Right.
If that's a Baharroth player needs to be aware of that. So yeah, it's something to consider. Now, with that, units like the like Ragnar's signature squad, they're easier to take out. So one of the things that I find is very ignored within Baharroth's pod is his shining blade. So it's not a spectacular warlord attachment. It's not as good as other ones, but it is something. So it keeps the units out of a fight, but still allows you to pick off those problematic units at the planet next to you. You only get one opportunity to do so, because anybody that is seeing what you're doing will just retreat from you and stop the battle at that particular planet.
Right.
But it does give you the opportunity to let off a sniper too.
Sure. So are you talking about maybe sending a unit to where they have like a void pirate and then attacking an adjacent black main sentinel or something to that effect?
Anything, yeah. But yes, send it to a planet where you're not going to take the hits that you don't want to take, and then use it to snipe off the guys that are helping your opponent win those command struggles.
Sure.
Because you do want to choke them out.
I mean, seeing as how it's a little bit more finicky than something as straightforward as like a Talisarian Tempest Blade, do you generally find yourself playing that attachment, or do you more hold it back for its shield value?
Yes. So I'd say it's a more situational piece.
Sure.
For sure. So I'd have to judge it on the situation that I'm in. More likely than not, I'm going to use it as a shield.
Sure.
But there is some use to it as an attachment. It does help.
Is it the kind of card you'd probably hold on to, not wanting to necessarily reveal that you have it in play, at the beginning of the game, something like that, I suppose?
Back when I was splashing Tau, I tried to use ambush platforms to make it a little more of a surprise.
Right.
And I found that there was no situation where I benefited from it being a surprise. Because if you're starting the fight, if you're sniping something off at an adjacent planet, in all likelihood, you've picked that fight. You've picked that fight to happen before anything can occur at that other planet.
Sure.
So they don't have the opportunity to react if you're playing it right. So without that ability to react, surprise or expectation, it doesn't matter.
Sure. Well, I suppose just looking at Baharroth as a whole, since, my question was about when do you generally find yourself playing this kind of card, what is your overall play strategy? So you mentioned, early on really trying to focus on denying your opponent command, so you're trying to limit their income of cards and resources as best you can. But how do you kind of play cards yourself? just what's some of your basic gameplay strategy?
So first and foremost, I am in my starting hand, I am looking for death from above. It's going to be a key factor in my starting play. It allows me to put a mobile unit into play at the 5th planet for 1 cost. So with that, I want to pair it with a 3 cost or higher mobile unit. Now, there are 10 in this deck, in most decks. If you're just talking the Baharroth's Hawks, that's 4 alone. Then you've got
Right.
Soaring Falcons, and then you've got the Vile Raider. So 10 potential targets for this card. It's a really good way to start the game. The other thing too is I am going to be looking for vaulting Harlequins, and I know this sounds bizarre. Nobody uses vaulting Harlequins but me, I think. But they are an unbelievably hardy unit. With 2 command pips, 4 health, I can exhaust them to make them flying. They're sticking around for a significant period of time. They may be only doing 1 damage per swing, but it's really difficult to take them out. Think of it as a cheap version of a Valkyrie. Those are a very hardy unit as well.
Sure.
So I fantastic and not to be overlooked, and great early on.
Definitely. I was going to say a cheap version of the Black Legion Helldrake, but
Yeah.
I suppose the Valkyrie is a little bit more realistic. But I suppose, what are some of your just favorite units to include? Like you mentioned, you've got a, predilection for the Soaring Falcon and different cards like that, but maybe more in a combat sense, what are some of the Eldar or Dark Eldar units that you do rely on? Outside of the signature squad, what's the bread and butter of your army?
I used to use Iand and Wraithguard. They ended up being a little too expensive on the 3 cost side for what they lend themselves. They don't really give much to the deck aside from a strength 4 armor bane unit.
Right.
That's and that, don't get me wrong, that's fantastic in its own right, but it's not lending itself to the theme. So typically, I would say the only must include is the Warlock Destructor.
Just purely for its, beefy body, its stubbornness.
Yeah, and the reason is that it's cheap. You're winning a lot of command, so you're going to have the resources to pay its upkeep. So there are benefits all over the place for that. 2, I would say, runners up. Bealtan Warp Spiders are fantastic because if you're in a position where you're not letting them get cards,
right,
then the Bealtan Warp Spiders allow you to choose what cards they get at the beginning of their next or during their upkeep phase.
Sure,
so
definitely.
It's great in that regard. And then the other one is the Wailing Wraith Fighter. So it's a 6 cost unit, and I'd usually like to include a couple of them. But yeah, being able to force the opponent to discard cards is again one of those abilities that when you're choking them out of cards, it's fantastic to just add insult to injury.
Definitely, and I mean that in and of itself, being a big beefy flyer is awfully stubborn and difficult to remove. So if each and every card you're forcing your opponent to discard is potentially something pretty valuable that they want to hold on to, whether they're, spending an event or an attachment, giving up that value for its shield value, or you're just denying them the opportunity to play something good, I could see that being absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. So the other thing, though, is to note about the Wraith Fighter is that it does compete with Wild Rider squadrons, which for a lot of people is the bread and butter of Eldar. If you were going to include any of those, you can already see that with all these mobile units, there's a lot of vehicles in the deck,
Sure.
potentially a lot of vehicles. So having it's
The Star
a star
Cannon.
cannon, yeah, that it's crucial. If you want punching power in a deck with a bunch of guys that have only one attack, giving them armor bane is really, really useful.
Definitely. I suppose, do you have any, just considering all the cards you've mentioned, any stories or memories really stand out prominently in your mind of when things have gone, according to plan, you've managed to pull off some effective combos or...
Most of it has to do with the star cannon and the wild riders. So they've, and not to say that they're must includes, but they have had a number of memorable moments for me. So giving them the star cannon and being able to move as a combat action. Important to note, they're not mobile. They're moving as a combat action.
Right.
It's fantastic. So they're swinging for 3, potentially unexpectedly.
Sure.
And that combos with Cry of the Wind. So we have Cry of the Wind, the signature event. After a unit moves from one planet to another, move that unit to an adjacent planet so they can move further.
Sure.
It also combos with Banner of the Ashen Sky, which is Baharroth's signature support. After a unit moves from one planet to another, exhausts its support to give that unit +2 attack for its next attack phase. So all of that combined just creates some fantastic hit and run capabilities.
Definitely. And I could very easily see a player, associating that event and that support with mobility as opposed to move, just because it's kind of such an uncommon effect.
Yeah, you bet. And that's the thing to be wary of, is that it is move. So there are other ways to do that. So one other one is Sicarius is Chosen. If somebody uses Sicarius is Chosen, you've just been your unit has moved.
Definitely. I'd have taken a little while to think of that one myself, so yeah, very well done.
Yeah, Cry of the Wind is a great counter to that, actually. So if Sicarius is Chosen moves you, you can move back.
Well, I suppose any other, competitive gameplay memories apart from, maybe something more Warlords specific where you've just been able to find another awesome use for any of those, signature cards. Like, I think you just mentioned some awfully clever usage cases for them.
Yep, it was actually kind of leading into a story where I was playing against Ragnar, and Ragnar is exceptionally good at bullying for the first planet.
Right.
And so I had a couple units on the first planet, nothing major, but Ragnar exhausted, and I had my Wild Rider squadron within 2. I used Cry of the Wind and Banner of the Ashen Sky. I moved with the Star Cannon on it, and I moved it to the first planet from the third, swinging for 5 and Armor Bane, and bloodied Ragnar. And it wasn't game winning, but it was fantastic to see. It was just one of those things where all the stars align, and you're going, "Yep, that worked right."
Sure.
So yeah,
It may not have won you the game, but it did crush your opponent's soul.
yeah, exactly. I don't even know. Maybe I did win that game, but regardless, it was the one takeaway from that game was I beat Ragnar. So
Sure. And I mean, at the very onset of this video, when you mentioned that this is more of a fun warlord maybe than a competitive one, just in having to design this card game to appeal to a broader audience than strictly those that go to the tournament scene, I always like to include that kind of question just because it appeals to, very much a different portion of the player base where it's, maybe I don't statistically win more than 50% of my games or something, but when I do win, it just leaves me with this feeling of like, it felt great. I really enjoyed the experience and I can walk away feeling like I had a genuinely good time.
yeah, for sure. And it does lend itself to some of those crazier moments. And I find that a lot of the competitive warlords don't necessarily do that because your argument is you're looking for consistency
Right.
as opposed to holy crap, did that just happen?
Right.
Right. So
The
it's great in that regard.
there's less of an emotional range probably when you're playing some other warlords.
Oh yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, with Baharroth, there's a lot of ups and downs because you're either losing horribly or winning in the most exceptional fashion. They're not drawing cards, and you're just crushing them. So it's a tough pill to swallow, and it's also a very tough warlord to navigate because of that.
Sure. Well, I mean, that's a big part of why I like to do this, spotlight series, because maybe in theory a warlord looks, too finicky on paper, or it looks too difficult to be extremely consistent in a tournament, but getting someone with a lot of genuine tabletop experience, such as yourself, to actually say, like, well, there's all these cool corner case uses, and if you actually, play this in this manner and build your deck accordingly, all sorts of things can be missed if somebody's just looking at it from a purely analytical standpoint, I think. Do you feel as if there's, potential as our card pool expands that Baharroth can take a place of prominence in like a competitive context?
Yeah, I think what really needs to happen is we need to see a couple more, um, going back to tabletop terms, Falcon chassis. So wave serpents, vehicles that should be mobile,
Right.
but aren't exceptionally strong in the attack, but give you more reason to play Death from Above, and also more targets for your star cannons. So I'm not asking for anything broken, nothing extreme, but something that let's just say adds to the overall synergy. Ideally, I wouldn't want to take any Dark Eldar. I'd love to see 100% mobile deck with just Baharroth at the head.
Right. Well, I think probably one of the coolest aspects of this game is just the mere notion that FFG has so much design experience in the LCG scene under its belt at this point, where, it combines all these different deck building options. It gives us so many different options. So I would hope that at some point, it's like, well, there's a compelling reason for me to stay completely within faction. There's a compelling reason for me to go with the Dark Eldar, or, the playstyle. There's a third option if I go with Tau, something like that. And then the Warlords change everything, but, even when you mention just the introduction of like a single additional vehicle or something like that, even, one additional card, if it's up to 3 copies in what essentially amounts to a 42 card deck minus your Warlord pod, I don't think it's necessarily going to take much to make some really big differences in how these decks function, and, as a result, their percentage rankings and their tier status.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. I mean, you can look at the Klavex War Leader as a great example of one card where splashing three of completely changes the power level of a deck. So that brought Kith to an unbelievably new unbelievable new level. I mean, she was good already, and then adding a Klavex War Leader just threw her over the top.
Sure.
So yeah, no, definitely agreed. And that's the kind of thing I'm looking for Baharroth. Whether we see that in the future, I don't know. I would love, like I said, to see more tanks and vehicles, and with more of the Eldar theme because of it.
Definitely. It goes without saying that anyone that follows our community is excited about the game, but I'm definitely curious to see where we're going to go, presumably in the direction of more elites and more vehicles, but, definitely only time will tell. But I suppose before we kind of bring things to a close and before I wrap up the interview here, any final advice, any opinions for either playing as Baharroth or going up against him that you'd like to share?
Practice. I would say that this is one warlord that it's not as forgiving. If you mess up where you move, if you're not expecting those surprise combat tricks, then you will find yourself in a position where you're not you've taken a game that you were going to win, and you've basically given it away. So lots and lots of practice, more so than most.
Sure. And I would imagine, for those games that you do end up winning or losing, or things that don't go well, instead of just feeling bad about it, really give it some critical thought for next time. Like, what didn't go right? How was my opponent able to exploit the way that I moved this or didn't move this in some cases, and different things like that. It seems, just as much as there's a high likelihood for excitement, there's definitely the potential, like you said, for things to go wrong, and just thinking about how to optimize your chances of probably winning as best you can.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
Yeah, he's a very unforgiving warlord. I think that's the best way to put it. So just be careful.
sure. Well, anything else you think is worth noting?
Uh, Not that I could think of offhand. I think we pretty much covered it. So, but thanks for having me on. I really appreciate this. And as always, your videos are great. So I look forward to seeing this one.
Well, thank you very much. I'll try not to disappoint, but thank you once again, Brian, for coming on. And just as a way of closing things out, why don't you plug one last time where our viewership can either check out your stuff or get in touch with you?
First Planet. So if you just Google us, you'll find our Twitter account, our Facebook account, and our Podbean website. So you can also find us on iTunes, First Planet Podcast. And yeah, Scott and I always like to chat as well. So hit us up through our Facebook account, or look us up on Card Game DB. Again, I go by Boogers McGee.
Awesome. And for anybody just listening, I'll be sure to include all the relevant links in the video description. So once again, thank you very much, Brian, and have an excellent day.
Thanks, Mitch. You too.
Well, now that our interview has come to a close, I'll just end this video by saying thank you once again for watching. Be sure to leave a comment sharing your own thoughts, opinion, perspective, and experience when it comes to Baharroth and the Eldar faction as a whole. Interacting with viewers like you is the absolute highlight of creating content for this channel, so please take a moment to let me know what you thought of this interview in particular, and exactly which warlords you'd like to see next. If you happen to know someone from our community that would make a good candidate for a future interview, feel free to share. But with that said, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you have not already done so. Contact me directly or keep in touch via all the social media if you'd like. And in any case, thank you so much for watching, and be absolute sure to check in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.